Just like a folk song, our love will be passed on. By Seralina. Posted to AO3 and fanfiction.net. Summary. A zombie apocalypse AU. Dean has been separated from Cass and Sam. He thinks they're dead. To keep himself from drowning in the pain, he shares stories about them with fellow survivors. Stories from their childhood. Ones filled with Cass's smile and Dean learning to accept himself, with only hints to the truth of Dean's feelings for Cass. One day Charlie has the brilliant idea to find their group a more permanent home. Things are going south quickly when the most unlikely and wonderful thing happens. Notes. Dedicated to ReadLover22. This is another winning piece from #FandomPubQuiz on TikTok, this time with a zombie apocalypse AU. As some of you know, I'm in the middle of writing a The Walking Dead crossover with SBN, so this will be good practice without having to worry about The Walking Dead plotlines. The title is referencing 7 by Taylor Swift from the now Grammy Award-winning album Folklore. Mind the tags if you're sensitive to gore. I think I'll be describing this one as fluffy gore with a side of hopeless longing. Thanks to Amber for reading through this story and encouraging me. I so appreciate you. I would also like to thank Amelia for helping me edit this whole podfic and keeping me motivated all these years. If it wasn't the bozos that got you, or the exposure, then it was the loneliness. Being in the north certainly made one of those things a bit easier for 6 to 8 months out of the year, but it made one of the others a lot harder. The last one was an expected constant after all the loss everyone had suffered. Something about the extreme cold, the amounts of snow, it slowed the bozos down. They froze in the deep cold and got buried in the snow. Even if you stumbled upon one, they never moved fast enough to be able to catch you off guard. Sure, they thawed in the summer, but there were whole roving bands of survivors that would pick off as many as possible during the winter. It was smart. It made sense why so many native northerners had survived this long. Sure, the initial wave had been rough because the fresh ones still moved with moderate speed, but as the years wore on, they seemed to be all right. Dean Winchester had carved out a place for himself in this world of cold and ice. He had a group who needed him, so he wasn't entirely lonely, but after the pain of losing his brother and his best friend, it was easier to maintain emotional distance. That was his rule, no commiserating, that he tried to abide by just to keep himself sane. Dean could carry that weight on his own, because it wasn't just his brother and best friend he'd lost. It had been his entire group. Flash flood situation back when they were still trying to make it down south. Maybe it had been a hurricane. It was hard to tell without meteorologists to keep an eye on the weather from above. He really didn't like going into it too much, especially when thinking about it all led to dark thoughts that were only chased away with alcohol, and that was all too scarce these days. So instead, he'd study maps, pore over them, looking for a place, the place they could finally settle down in. Their group had been roaming for a few years now. He owed everything to them. They'd pulled him out of the rushing waters and saved his life even when he didn't feel like he deserved to live. Bobby kicked his ass and sent him off on new missions. Ellen made sure he ate even when food was scarce and Dean tried to give it up for the younger ones. Charlie made sure he laughed still, talking about all their old nerdy interests and debating things from Star Wars and Lord of the Rings until someone had to break them up. Victor followed him out on missions when he was being especially reckless and stupid, kept him in check, and also kicked his ass from time to time. Even Cassie was there once in a while, the only one who knew him from before. He'd thought for a while they might have something again. She kicked ass, and she was gorgeous. Cassie was, as everyone around him reminded him, perfect for him. But what they didn't understand was Cassie deserved better than him. Not that he hadn't tried, he just couldn't seem to find it in himself to give her his whole self. He'd loved her once. He knew he had, but these days that didn't seem to be an option. His heart just seemed like a proverbial ache, always there and present, proving yet again why he kept an emotional disconnect where he could. He didn't know if it did any good. It wasn't like he ever talked about them. Cass, Sam, and the rest of his family. He'd grown up with them. They'd spent their whole lives pre-apocalypse having ridiculous adventures. He told stories of them whenever he could to whoever would listen. Tonight, it was Garth and Billy, the most polar opposite people that you could find in the camp. Garth listened with rapt attention, facing you and reacting to every single thing, maybe laughing a bit too loud and asking a few too many questions. Billy barely even acknowledged your presence, other than the occasional non-committal hum or barely raised eyebrow, and if Dean's story was especially entertaining, he might even get a small smirk. When I think of Cass and me as kids, we were always running through the trees, Dean said from his chair near the fireplace. It was early March, so they were all still bundled up and spending time making sure they could stay warm. The small section of upper-class houses they'd found to stay in had all been well and solidly built. Mainly they spent the day searching out food or picking off the bozos they found laying around. It was cold, but they weren't always fearing for their lives. We used to run away from Sammy when he was little. He always wanted to be around us, hang out with us, and we let him. For the most part. Some days I just needed time with my friend. Makes sense, Garth chimed in with a nod from where he was stoking the fire. Billy sat back in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, seemingly staring off into space and ignoring them. The rest of the group had picked other rooms in the house. Half the reason they'd stayed was the amount of fireplaces throughout the mansion. That way, they didn't have to spend every night in a cold huddle on the floor. They could actually spread out. Can't be a big brother all the time, Garth continued. I loved Sammy. Being his big brother was one of the best things in my life. But Cass, that was different. We used to swing into this creek, daring each other to go higher and higher before we would jump off. When Dad first hung it up, he called Cass a coward. We were only 7 at the time, so the drop to the water seemed so far, but Cass was stubborn, even in the face of John Winchester. I always envied him for that. He was better at standing up to my asshole of a father than I was. Dean smiled a bit and looked down, his hands itching for a bottle or a glass, something to dull the ache that flared up. He shook his head a bit to clear his thoughts, then looked back up into the fire. That night I snuck out of my house. Don't know how I wasn't caught. I scaled up the side of Kaz's house and got him out of bed. Dean chuckled softly to himself. He always had the worst bedhead. He looked at me so confused, but Kaz, he always trusted me. So he got out of bed, put his swimsuit on, and we went back to the creek. Dean closed his eyes and he could just see it, though the memory was more than 2 decades old. The stars had been so clear that night they reflected in Cass's eyes, which were a nicer shade than that of the creek. The air had felt crisp without being cool. They were warm with the adrenaline of sneaking out, which made their smiles especially bright every time they glanced at each other. Young enough that they could still hold hands because they didn't yet know how society felt about that. We'd been swimming in that creek for years at that point. And yeah, maybe it was stupid to go out there by ourselves when we were so young, but it felt important at the time. Dean paused and ran a hand down his face. Garth was watching him with his usual kind eyes that Dean couldn't look at. They were too sympathetic in the best and worst ways. Anyway, I told him I'd go in the water, that I'd pull him up after he plunged in. I wouldn't let him get sucked under or drown or float away. He said he'd do it because he wanted to be brave for me. But he was the bravest person I've ever known. So he did it. I went in the water. He got on the swing and swung into the water. He overshot a bit and crashed right into me, but it was so worth it. All of it. We snuck back in that night as the sky was just starting to get light again. Sounds like you guys had fun. Garth smiled wistfully. One of the reasons Dean loved talking with Garth and Billy is because neither felt the need to throw in their own stories every other sentence. They both just listened. Garth would talk sometimes, ridiculous stories usually involving how clumsy he's always been, but especially as a child. Garth was good at getting people to laugh at his own expense. We did. Kept doing it all throughout growing up. It was our thing. Midnight swims in the creek, jumping off the swing and trying to catch the other one, which half the time ended up in a wrestling match. What happened the other half? Billy spoke up from her corner, her look full of meaning that crowded Dean's throat. Nausea crept up on him. He clasped his hands together, appearing to rub them for warmth, but actually to shake off the full body feeling of loss. Garth shot a nasty look at Billy that Dean would have missed, except he knew these people too well, and they knew him. Garth had noticed his abrupt change in demeanor. It didn't matter if his face didn't show it, because some part of him did. Cassie and him had dated for a bit back when she was in college and Dean was just roaming, trying to find his place in the world while Cass had been away at college and Sam had been at his fancy boarding high school. Dean had loved her, but when he'd told her the truth of who he was, she had run away. Unable to accept, or maybe just too young to understand. She did now. She'd grown up a bit, or perhaps the apocalypse had put a little perspective into her life. Hard to tell, but what mattered was she was good about it now. Didn't judge him. The only thing Dean hated about her was how she always seemed on the edge of pressing him to talk about things he didn't want to think about. One day, while they were studiously poring over maps and cross-referencing with other maps, she tapped him on the wrist, lightly touching the bracelets there. "Do they have a story?" she asked gently, and Dean almost pulled away, but one look into her eyes and he knew he was about to spill something. He let out a sigh, wondering when they had all become each other's therapists. Dean gently pulled his wrist away from her to look at the bracelets, as much a part of him as his leather jacket and car had once been. He made a motion to play with his ring and was once again reminded where it had gone, which left a faint pang in his chest. He twisted his fingers around where the ring once sat to stave it off, a nervous habit he knew the whole camp had seen him do 1,000,000 times. He looked at the faded friendship bracelet, braided into a sturdy pattern, and the black elephant hair bracelet next to it. Cass used to make them. He was obsessed with them one summer, Dean said, indicating the faded rainbow-colored bracelet. "I had loads for a while. Some were definitely better than others," Dean said with a small huffed laugh. "Do you know about the superstition around friendship bracelets?" Dean asked Cassie. She shook her head and smirked at him kindly. "No? You should tell me," she said, and reached out to grab his hand. Not any sort of move on him, just one friend supporting another. Dean squeezed her hand back. "You're supposed to let the person who made it for you tie it on, and you can't take it off until it falls off," Dean told her. A free finger went down to his own wrist and traced it lightly. "What happens if you take it off too soon?" Cassie asked. "Then the wish doesn't come true," Dean told her without looking up. His chest felt like it was caving in. "I don't know what Cass's wish was, so I can only hope it was a good one, since this one has been on my wrist since we were 17. He'd given me others since then, but this one is the stubborn one." "I remember you had that one plus a few others when I met you," Cassie said as she nodded. "Why those colors?" she asked, and Dean sighed, remembering the series of events that led up to this specific bracelet. "Cass had been struggling with something for a few months. I knew he was hiding something from me, and it was driving me crazy because we always told each other everything. Finally, one day we're out in the woods, and he pulls this out of his backpack. Said he was sorry for how he'd been acting, but he was ready to tell me now. All this time, he's pulling this rainbow thing through his fingers because he's all nervous and flushed with worry." Dean smiled a bit, remembering how easily Cass could get flustered in the right situations. "He wanted to tell me he was gay. He needed to tell me, then he begged me not to tell anyone. He was worried, because of the asshole my dad was, that maybe I'd hate him for wanting to love guys." Dean scoffed at that and rubbed a hand on the back of his neck. "I almost smacked him for that. Told him he clearly didn't know me at all if he thought there was anything that would ever make me turn my back on him." He doesn't say it out loud. Part of the memory just for him was the crashing relief on Cass's face. The way he'd teared up and threw his arms around Dean. How Dean had felt Cass's tears on his neck. How fiercely they held each other. He remembered distinctly the feel of Cass's beating heart against his chest, and the answering beat of his own, feeling like an earthquake between them. That distinct feeling of not wanting to let him go, to just keep holding him forever, that had floored Dean in the moment. Castiel, his nerdy, adorable best friend, who ran through the woods with him and went for night swims and cared for Sam like he was his own brother. Cass had pulled back and wrapped the bracelet on Dean. He had been putty in Cass's hands. He was present in the moment, but there was also screaming in his head. There was a moment where Cass had hesitated in tying, but then he'd looked up at Dean and met his eyes with something hopeful and almost shy. Then Dean had watched his skilled fingers wrap the most beautiful knot with the ends. The occasional brush of those fingers on Dean's skin did what they always did, but now there was another layer. A realization. "What about this one?" Cassie asked, pulling Dean out of his memories. Sammy. Cass taught him how to make them, but Sam didn't think he could get away with making me another rainbow one. So for my 21st birthday, he made me this." Dean remembered his little brother's firm and determined look on his face when he made Dean promise to try to find happiness and stop worrying about what everyone else thought. Sam had always been wise beyond his years. Knew Dean had been struggling so much at the time. "Do you ever..." Cassie started hesitantly and looked up at him, biting her lip. She let out a puff of air. Dean, you survived. Do you ever think—
No,
Dean said firmly, his voice dropping into a threatening gravel. Cassie continued, voice pitched soft but frantic, as if she'd thought about this for a while and just never dared to say it. They were both strong, full-grown men. They could have been pushed to the other bank.
Cassie, I said no.
They're dead. That's that. Dean pulled away from her, shutting down to fight off the ache that felt more like a stab at her unnecessary insistence. He grabbed some maps and left the room, unable to even feel her false hope pressing on his firm certainty. They were both dead. Sam and Castiel didn't survive the flood, because if they had somehow survived, potentially as injured or worse off than he was, he had never searched for them. If they had survived only to die because they were waiting for Dean to— He couldn't let himself go down that train of thought, not without a bottle to drown away the side effects of misplaced hope. Charlie could often get more out of him than just nerdy things. He would tell her about the parts of him and his past that still ripped him open, and she would tell him hers. It was a trade in vulnerability, so that they both always had ammunition they would never use. Charlie was like a little sister to him, and her girlfriend Jo. Though where Charlie was all bubbly smarts, Jo was all deadly information. They were a perfect pair. But Jo was a little harsher with her caring towards Dean. She got that from her mother, and by association, neither were included in the super-secret Dean and Charlie talks. It's weird. I can't tell if the apocalypse has made me better at therapizing my friends, or if our problems are just more obvious now that we're all colored similar shades of trauma. Charlie said with a bit of a hiccup. They were on a gathering mission and stumbled upon a full bottle of the good stuff, as Charlie had dubbed it. Dean tended toward the thought that anything was good, but Charlie insisted that this stuff had been top shelf. So here they were, sprawled out on the floor of some unnamed place they'd found refuge in for the night. Heads put together side by side on the floor so they could hear each other easily, but also so they could both gaze up through the small hole in the roof at the stars. I had the same thought a few weeks ago. How much we have to be therapists for each other and not a single one of us with any degree in psychology, Dean told her and sat his head up slightly for another sip. Speak for yourself, Winchester. I know plenty about psychology, Charlie told him indignantly, and Dean just scoffed. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Headshrink. And you got your degree from where? The college of any online information you could digest in a week-long obsession? Dean snarked back at her, and Charlie laughed easily. Hey, you have no right to judge my methods of learning. I'm the smartest person you know, Charlie bantered back. You're the smartest person I've ever known. You'd even give Sam and Cass a run for their money, Dean told her honestly, and heard Charlie giggle just a bit. Anyway, your mom sounds like she reacted exactly how I expected her to after all the stories you've told me about her. She really loved you, Charlie said kindly and nudged Dean with her elbow. What about your dad? Dean sighed, knowing this was Charlie cashing in a chip to something Dean avoided as part of their friend therapy relying on mutual vulnerability. John Winchester was a ghost Dean liked imagining only in his past. Cass hated him, if that gives you any idea. Dean opened up, and though he'd told her about John before, it had always been a passing mention of another story, how he'd influenced one small thing. He takes another swig of drink and forges on. He was an asshole. Charlie reached out and grabbed his hand. He gripped it like a lifeline. What did he do? Charlie asked softly, and Dean scoffed. Barely anything good. Sometimes we went to a baseball game or we'd tie up a swing at the creek. Sometimes there would be weeks where he was fine, and he loved Mom. That was one thing he never did wrong, even when he was deep in a bender. He always came home. Dean let his arm drape across his eyes and felt Charlie squeeze him reassuringly. It was the PTSD. Dad was in Nam. It messed him up so bad, but it didn't hit him till after the house fire. We lived in motels for a few weeks, the four of us. Sam was just a baby, so he doesn't remember. We barely slept. Dad kept waking up screaming, so then he started drinking just so he could sleep. At first, we were relieved, but then he didn't stop. He lost his job. Mom had to go back to work, and she was brilliant. Dad was falling apart, and she never wavered. She was always there for us. Dean swallowed thickly. Thinking about his mom was always a sure way to make him weepy. But this was Charlie. He could tell her. He'd told her practically everything by this point, so he could give her this too. Share the weight a bit and maybe it would be a bit less heavy. But Mom, she had to go away sometimes. She was in business with her father and some cousins. So when she was away, she would threaten Dad to shape up. And he did during the day, but at night... Dean let out a breath of air. Charlie squeezed his hand and Dean let his arm slip down from over his eyes. He never hit us. Never laid a hand on us, other than spanking a bit when we were really young. But he wasn't himself when he would drink. Like half of him just slipped sideways out his ear. Dean tried not to shudder at the mental picture in his head, but kept talking by sheer will of not letting it drown him. He would walk a bit funny. His one eye would go all squinty. I once asked him why, and he said 'cause it hurt. That was one of the first signs. Sometimes he would just get caught staring off into space. Other times you'd catch the smell off him and you'd be sure he'd wet himself. Dean swallowed, feeling his eyes prick with the beginnings of tears. Then there was the yelling. Sometimes I don't know if he even realized quite how loud it was. Other times I knew he did. Sometimes he would just rant and rave about us, about the town, about his jobs. He had them occasionally. Sometimes he would be so bad. It was scary, especially when we were young. I used to take Sammy and we'd hide in a closet. I'd lock us in and give Sammy some headphones so he could fall asleep. Then I'd wait, the whole night sometimes, for him to pass out so I could carry Sam to bed. One time he just sat outside the closet, waiting, but didn't see us. I don't know what he was seeing. Dean shook his head. As we got older, it was more clear that it was just pathetic. He was crippled by his addiction and he could barely see us through the haze. Sam despised him for it. He only ever knew the person Dad was with a bottle in his hand. Never saw him for who he actually was. By the time he actually wanted to get sober, it was too late. Dean let that hang in the air. He could feel Charlie breathing next to him, felt her tiny palm wrapped around his. He didn't deserve her, and yet he had her. There were a lot of times where Cass would come in the house when he heard John yelling. When I was young, and even when I was a teenager, Cass was always pulling me out of hell. Saving me from bullshit at school, too. I'd get into fights. But he'd hear my dad going off, so he'd come in the house and tell him off. It always shocked the hell out of John. This tiny, dark-haired, blue-eyed little thing telling him to shut up and stop scaring his sons. Then he would come and find us and take us over to his house for the night. His dad was an alcoholic, too, but the pass-out and distant kind. Barely ever saw him, really. Dean smiled, thinking of one particular night. Sometimes we'd go over to his house, and his dad was nowhere to be seen. Cass said he was the heaviest sleeper, so we would put Sammy to bed, and then we'd play pirates, or cowboys, or astronauts, or anything we could come up with. But usually the first two, because they were my favorite. And Cass knew I wouldn't be able to sleep easily till I got Dad's episode off my mind. I wish I could have met him, Charlie said wistfully. He heard a shuffling noise as she turned to look at him, so Dean tilted his head to look at her. Would we have gotten along? Dean couldn't help but smile a bit at the thought. Oh, definitely. You two would have gotten on like a house on fire, Dean told her, and Charlie winced. Hey, I'm allowed to joke about it. I actually survived a house fire. She laughed lightly at that. Did you ever tell your dad about... Charlie wiggled her eyebrows a bit, and Dean let out a huff and couldn't hold back a wince. Ooh, that bad? Worse, and actually not too bad, he said, turning back to look at the ceiling. What's that supposed to mean? Charlie asked, curiosity eating at her, which just made Dean chuckle. He didn't take it well, but when he started spewing some bullshit, well, Mom punched him. She did what? Charlie asked with a squeak at the end, sitting up to stare at Dean in disbelief. Dean just nodded. Simultaneously one of the worst and best moments of my life, Dean told her. And they stayed together? Charlie asked incredulously. Dean just chuckled. That was the tipping point. Mom ripped him a new one. Said she put up with it for long enough, that he'd already wrecked his relationship with one of his sons, and if he said one more bad thing to me, it wouldn't just be that relationship he would be ruining. Ooh, your mom was a badass, Charlie said in awe. Dean nodded. She was. he said with a smile on his face. After a few more moments of comfortable silence, she settled back down on the floor next to him. He could feel her gearing up to ask another question. There was no point avoiding it. He knew it would come out when she got the will. What about when you told Cass? I'm assuming you told him first. Charlie got out finally, sending Dean reeling back to the time when he wasn't sure he was ever going to tell anyone. At the time, it felt like the end of his world. The horrible irony was that it was the end of the world. He told Cass just as the first weird news reports were starting. At the time, it all seemed like background information. Not like they lived in a big city or anything. Lawrence was small enough to just not worry about what those big places got up to. He'd said goodbye to his parents and taken off with Sam and Cass for their road trip. It was supposed to be a last hurrah for all three of them. Cass, who had done his undergrad at Kansas Tech, would be moving to NYC to attend Columbia for his graduate degree. Then Sam would be moving to California so he could go to Stanford. Dean would be left alone, still unsure of his life, torn between the two coasts with his two favorite people and his parents in the middle. They were going to take 2 weeks, hit everything from the biggest ball of twine, Cass's choice, to some national parks, Sam's choice, and down to New Orleans for some fun, Dean's choice, obviously. Hello, Earth to Dean. Where are you? Charlie nudged him with her elbow, and Dean shook his head to clear it. Sorry, it's just... When I told them all, it was only a few weeks before. You remember how things started on the coast and then spread inward? Well, when I first told Cass was also the first day I remember hearing about how weird people were acting in L.A. Oh, wow, that's some serious timing you have there, Charlie said, and Dean huffed out a bitter laugh. You're telling me, Dean said, mind still stuck on the road trip that separated all of them from their parents permanently and led them down this deadly path where Dean was left alone, just like he'd been worrying about before the trip. He'd trade anything to have his brother and best friend only on opposite coasts. You don't have to tell me about telling Cass, but it might be a better place than wherever your brain is heading now. Charlie piped up, and Dean wanted to curse at her, but knew better. She knew him too well. His whole rule about not commiserating with these people, stewing in his misery, always wavered around her. Charlie was right. Thinking about the good moments with Cass always made him feel a bit better, even if it stirred up that ache inside of him. Charlie wanted him to share the weight with her. We were in the woods. Of course you were, Charlie quips, which makes Dean roll his eyes. We were in the fort we had built. Cass refused to call it a tree house since we had built it for tactical advantages. What were the advantages? Charlie asked. We could see anyone coming from a long way away. We also camouflaged the hell out of it. Cass was a genius. He figured out how to get these vines to grow over and around it so we didn't have to use fake ones. He had the idea to use a rope ladder instead of one nailed to a tree, and I figured out this way to rig it up to the base of the fort. That way we could hide a string that would unravel it for easy access. Genius, Charlie breathed out, clearly impressed. So you were up there when you told him? Dean nodded and continued. I'd say we snuck out, but seeing as we were both over 18... Anyway, it was night, and we were having a sleepover up there just like we always used to. We had some real lanterns up there that we put candles in instead of kerosene, and we had padded chunks of the floor so it was real cozy. Only needed blankets or sleeping bags. Normally I was roaming the country while he was at college, but in the summer we would both come home and spend time together. This time, though, I'd left him a note. Told him to come find me there later that night. I was up there all day worrying my way through multiple attempts. Dean's hand went to his wrist where he played with the faded rainbow friendship bracelet there. Charlie saw the movement and realization dawned on her face. You gave him a bracelet like he did for you, didn't you? A pink, purple, and blue one? Charlie asked excitedly. Yeah, but it took me like 10 tries to get it just right. Even when I had something passable, it was never as neat as Cass's were. Dean shook his head, remembering how many times his dumb fingers kept getting in the way, how many times he'd pinched them when tying a knot. So Cass, of course, didn't ask why I'd summoned him to our old hangout. I mean, we were 20 at that point. We didn't go up there super often anymore. But like I said, he didn't press it. We just hung out and talked and argued and whatnot till it was well past midnight. The lanterns were burning low and both of us were getting sleepy when he finally asked if there was a reason why I'd left him a note instead of just texting him or even just telling him. I nearly clammed up, but I was determined if I was going to tell someone, it had to be Cass. He'd understand. Of course I was worried about all the biphobia crap, but I knew Cass could never be like that to me. Dean shook his head at his past self even worrying about stuff like this. Cass was the most understanding, kind, and wonderful person he'd ever met. So you gave him the bracelet? Bet you didn't even say a word. Charlie prompted, but he could hear the smile in her voice. Dean huffed out a laugh. Yeah, I just couldn't get words out. And Cass was always watching me so carefully. He saw me blush despite the low light. I know it. I stumbled to form words, so I just gave up and then pulled it out of my pocket and held it out for him to see. I didn't watch his face at first, 'cause I was too nervous. But after a moment, he asked if it was for him. I somehow grumbled out yes, so he grabbed it really carefully to look at it. Dean remembered the reverent look on Cass's face as he examined the bracelet as if it were something precious and priceless. How he'd achingly waited for Cass to say something, anything, to indicate he knew what it meant. He'd never even made Cass one of the bracelets before. Sure, Cass had tried to teach him, but Dean always gave up. It was Cass's thing, not his. Eventually, he looked up at me like he was about to cry, which freaked me out for a moment, till he just said he was so proud of me. Bet you cried, Charlie whispered teasingly. Dean darted his eyes at her and scoffed at that, but he didn't answer because he absolutely had. He asked me to put it on him, and I did while he instructed me how to tie it like he had with his rainbow one. We hugged. End of story. Charlie protested minorly, but Dean just shoved her and they lapsed into an easy quiet where Dean could actually play the memory over again for himself. He would tell Charlie anything, but she didn't need all the details. Like the way his heart had pounded so loud in the quiet space of Cass's quiet affirmations. How Cass's instructional whispers had prickled up and down his skin, leaving him covered in goosebumps. The way Dean had let his fingers linger on Cass's wrist just after he'd finished tying the knot. How he'd let his fingers ghost a trail down Cass's hand before they dropped back into his lap. Specifically, though, Dean lost himself in the memory of Cass's eyes when he'd met them just after that. Dean's breath had caught in his throat, his chest seemed to clog, his heart puttering wildly out of rhythm at the way Cass seemed to look at Dean like he was his everything. But Dean had known then it wasn't true. Maybe Dean's path to bisexuality had started with the moment his best friend had told him about his own sexuality. That wasn't Cass's truth, though. Just because Dean had gone and been the total cliché queer who fell in love with his best friend didn't mean anything for Cass's side. He'd spent 3 years coming to terms with that fact, as well as understanding and realizing it wasn't just Cass that he was attracted to. But in that space, in those few inches between them after Dean had given Cass this piece of himself, he liked to pretend that Cass had wanted Dean to kiss him. It would feature prominently in his dreams for years to come, that look. Sure, in the next year he would meet Cassie, who was fun and pretty. Dean had really liked her. He was willing to try with her, the whole relationship thing that was never his style, and the honesty thing. But it wasn't ever love, because no matter how hard he tried to get away from it, he always just pictured Cass. He was much better suited to the one-night stand lifestyle. Pretending was easy if it lasted only for the night, but longer than that made him feel guilty. Any relationship he would enter into for longer than a night felt disingenuous. It wasn't fair to the other person that Dean couldn't give his whole self. No one deserved to be led on like that. When he had pictured his future or his ideal relationship or anything like that, it had always been with Cass by his side. Always within reach. Even now, in this apocalyptic wasteland, 7 months since the flood that had taken the 2 most important people away from him, it was hard to imagine any type of future. He continued on, because doing anything else would be a disservice to their memory and their love for him. Even when it felt like some days he was just existing, he'd push himself forward, reminding himself to live. They'd talked about it back in the early days of the apocalypse. The what-ifs in case they lost each other. Sam had told him to find someone to protect, so he'd found a group. Cass had told him to let people in, had hammered it into him, really. Dean, you're a people person, as they say. You need people. You'll want to shut down and run away, but remember, even if it's only one person, it counts. Cass's words echoed to him across the months and straight into the gaping hole in his chest where he belonged. His no commiserating rule was a complete sham. He told stories about Sam and Cass to anyone who would listen. He had these sessions with Charlie and Cassie, Garth even. Maybe he wasn't always sharing the sad bits, but he was still spreading out the weight of the pain that even the happy memories caused. "Do you ever think—" Charlie spoke up, but cut herself off. "What?" Dean asked after she didn't finish her questions. "Nothing," Charlie said far too quickly. "Charlie," Dean said with only a bit of annoyance, which made Charlie yield with a sigh. "It's okay to hope, Dean. I know it hurts, but considering everything that is this world, it's okay to let yourself want something," Charlie said quietly. Dean didn't answer her. Sam had been so distinct and giant that Dean didn't often mistake bozos for his brother. Few people were as tall as him, but Cass, that was much harder. Dean would be carefully and methodically hacking his way through a crowd of bozos. Even out on his own, he was a force to be reckoned with. But if he saw a bozo just a bit shorter than him with messy dark hair, his heart would seize and his breathing would catch. It was his biggest weakness. Thankfully, or maybe not so thankfully, they were never Cass. If one of them was, then maybe Dean could actually move on instead of having to constantly lie and knock down the people around him who told him to hope. He was especially vicious on the ones that looked like Cass, all that anger and grief boiling over into something he could kill. A clean slice through the neck of the gooey flesh, a satisfying stab into an eyeball socket, even just smashing the hell out of their skulls, curb stomping when given the opportunity. The same way he felt about the stabbing sensation of hope every time he thought he saw that familiar dark bedhead. He wished he could just kill the hope, too. That way he would be able to live without the ghosts of his family always hanging over him. Dean especially grieved the life he could have had with Cass had he not been such a coward for most of his life. His thumb rubbed at his empty ring finger, his fingers trying to twist the jewelry that wasn't there. When he returned to his camp that night, covered in gore and smelling absolutely vile, Charlie approached him practically vibrating with excitement. "I have an idea," she told him, bouncing from foot to foot, her nose barely wrinkled once she got close to him. "Bobby and Ellen think it's a good idea, but they wanted me to ask you what you think," Charlie told him as she followed behind Dean, who wasn't stopping on his mission to rinse the day off of him. "Why ask me?" Dean asked. He wasn't the leader of their group. They didn't operate in a dictatorship fashion by any means. It was more Bobby and Ellen called the shots, and anyone could voice their opinion, but if you still disagreed with the final move, then you could find a highway to start walking down. "Because you're the best fighter and the smartest one about tactical advantage," Charlie said with an eye roll like it was totally obvious. "Both Bobby and Ellen trust you with their lives. Hell, Dean, this entire camp does. Your opinion means something." Dean wanted to scoff at that, but he couldn't. As much as he liked being trusted, he couldn't help the part of him that said everyone was making a giant mistake about that. He hadn't been able to keep his brother or best friend safe, and who was this group by comparison? "So what is it? This plan? You've got 5 minutes before I'm stripping," Dean told Charlie, who aptly shuddered. "Yeah, I don't need to see that. Got it." She took a deep breath in preparation. "You know the Mall of America?" "Yeah, big-ass mall a bit more northeast of here." "Why?" Dean looked at her, suspicions rising. Charlie was biting her lip before the words just seemed to burst out of her. "I think we should go live there," she squeaked out. Dean stopped dead in his tracks and turned back to look at her. "What?" he said with enough incredulity to let Charlie know he thought she'd lost her mind. Okay. This is the same way Bobby and Ellen reacted, but I've got a plan, seriously." Charlie held up her hands, babbling super fast as she tried to explain. "The place is basically an entire city. Tons of backup generators hidden on the property, plus it's this massive cement structure, so we don't need to worry about its integrity long term. Tactically, we could set it up for really easy defense, and in a place that big, we could easily grow our group, start really trying to live in this dystopian future. Biggest challenge would be clearing the dead out, but I think I have a plan for that too, but you've got a better mind for that than me. I'm just a nerd with a plan and a freaky retention rate for unnecessary facts or floor plans." Charlie said that last part with an eyebrow wiggle that made Dean chuckle just a bit. "You're crazy," Dean told her. "I know it's—" "But I think it might be worth it," Dean interrupted her, and Charlie positively glowed. "Really?" She smiled at him, clearly restraining herself a bit. "If nothing else, there would be potentially a lot of supplies we don't find much of elsewhere. Plus that place has a bunch of mini-golf and arcades. We could use some fun in the apocalypse. Clearing it out will be hard." It will take everyone and we'll have to be super careful. Methodically approaching each section, being super thorough. We'll want maps. A few more people, like Victor, in on this. Some heavy load trucks, cement blockers, so Charlie jumped up and hugged him despite the filth, squeaking happily. Ugh, you're so gross, but thank you. You're my favorite person ever, and don't tell my girlfriend I said that. Dean patted her back and smiled at her. Don't thank me just yet. We'll have to convince everyone else, Dean told her. Charlie nodded and grimaced down at her clothes. Well, thanks for believing in me at least. Now go get ungrossed and come find me so we can plan. Charlie smiled evilly as if they were planning a prank war and not the biggest move their group would ever do. Dean shook his head at her antics as he headed into the bathroom. They didn't have running water, but he could still rinse off in the tub with a bucket and some soap. It was late March now. Almost April. If they moved fast, they could get to the mall when the bozos were still slow. Charlie's tactical plan had been smart. Under the mall was where the old commuter rail used to end, as well as buses. There were a lot of railings and fences. All they needed to do was open the doors into the mall and make a lot of noise to summon them down. From what they could tell, the mega mall had been used as a refugee camp in the early days. But things had gone sour. Very, very sour. Now the building was a mess of half fortified, half infested with bozos. Dean had a thrill running through his veins as the adrenaline kicked into high gear. It would take days, if not weeks, of careful sweeping and planning to get the bozos out and keep them from getting back in. For now, the plan was very slowly and carefully pressing forward, fortifying, then pressing forward again, section by section, bit by bit, making sure they were good on 3 sides before moving more into danger. It was going well. Dean was calling out directions, Bobby and Ellen on either side making sure the rest of the team was paying attention. Charlie was directing Dean. Joe was covering her while Victor covered Dean. They made their way out of the old train station up the first set of escalators. The goal today was to make it into the rotunda and block off the offshoots from it, while also fortifying the stores immediately there. Charlie was particularly excited about the Barnes & Noble. Joe was creeped out by the idea of the aquarium, which also gave Dean the creeps. They would not be tackling that today either. Victor just wanted to know if the subway would still have that familiar bread smell. Once they broke out onto the main floor, the smells of rotting flesh and fish were overpowering. A few people had to break from formation as they lost the contents of their stomach. The bozos were overwhelming. They hadn't made too much noise, but that didn't seem to matter because the bozos were making enough noise to summon more of them. Then the open flow plan was causing lots of crashing noises as the bozos in the upper levels fell over the railings and obliterated themselves on the bottom floor. For the most part, that killed them, but the ones falling from only 1 floor above often survived enough to cause issues. It turned to chaos quickly. They needed to get their truck with the cement blocker into the mall, but there wasn't a way to do it without making a fuck ton of noise. Just smash through the front! Dean called out to the guys, and Garth took off, leading that team back down into the train station to coordinate. Smashing up in the front is going to leave us open to more dead from outside the mall, Charlie told him, which Dean already knew. We were going to have to block off the main doors with cement anyway. As is, we need more time in here. We're going to get seriously fucked over, Dean told her, which made Charlie grimace and nod. She sent Joe over to the doors to direct the truck boys through. Even though Garth aimed the vehicle carefully, there would still be a problem. The digger they had found downstairs they had brought out to knock down the cement vehicle stoppers, and with that destroyed, Garth plowed through. To say little of it, it was loud. But once the hole was made, they were able to block off the chunk of the left wing not blocked by the benches. Didn't change the fact that the loud truck echoing in the mall, plus the chorus of growling noises, seemed a cacophony determined to draw even more. Guys? Joe called to Dean and Charlie, pointing toward the blockade out of the rotunda and into the amusement park. We didn't set that up, right? She asked, then pulled back to hack into the skull of another bozo approaching her. Blondie, don't you think we would have noticed Garth driving over there? Victor said as he kicked one in the leg and plunged his weapon into its skull. Guys, not now, Dean snapped, not in the mood to deal with them bickering. Well, I'm just saying, the refugee camp wouldn't have set it up. Joe snarked back, words seemingly armed to spite Victor while informing everyone else. She has a point, Charlie said to Dean from where she stood just behind him. What? Dean glanced back at her and over at the blockade. Y'all think there might be another group in here? He called out a bit louder. Well, let's hope they're friendly. Now stop yapping, you idiots, and concentrate, Bobby scolded from where he was back by the escalators to the aquarium, still poking out the dead as they climbed up. His admonishment was well timed, too. Just then, a shattering sound from above, and many, many more bozos fell from the higher floors into the rotunda. Son of a bitch, Dean cursed. The operation was going sideways quick, and everyone was getting tired. If they had to retreat while fighting their way out, it might be the end of all of them. Dean! Charlie called in a fear-tinged voice as she fell, a bozo on top of her with another snapping at her neck. Dean's fear made his reflexes fast. He killed the bozo on her, but was grabbed before he could pull it off. He hacked the thing's arm off, congealed blood substance splattering everywhere. Then he stuck his blade in its head. He moved as fast as he could, but there were so many bozos that he was losing sight of his people. He could hear Charlie behind him and Joe cursing at the ones around her, but he couldn't see Victor. Fear clogged his throat. He wanted to call out for him, but was worried about drawing even more into this mess. Suddenly, someone with blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail jumped down into the fray from the blockade into the amusement park. She hacked and sliced with skill, and Dean watched amazed as more people hopped from the other side of the barrier. "Hey, sounded like trouble. Need a hand?" asked the blonde in a thick Minnesotan accent. Dean almost laughed from how silly it sounded in the middle of the fray. Charlie did laugh. "Yes, please," Charlie asked, and Dean got the impression she would have hugged the woman if she wasn't so busy. "Where the hell did you lot come from?" asked another woman with short brown hair and skill similar to the blonde woman's that made Dean think they had been trained in hand-to-hand before this all started. "Just some ambitious dumbasses trying for a better life," Victor answered, which made Dean breathe a little easier. Their casual yelled conversation was almost comedic. Too bad it couldn't last. 20 or so people managed to make the work easier after they'd all jumped the blockade, but the bozos just kept coming. Dean's group kept working to clear a path for Garth. They needed a good path so the truck was still operable, and Garth was almost done blocking off the right side. As the blocks were placed, more people took up space behind them with spears to poke at the bozos gathering on the other side. Just as things seemed to be clearing up for them, they all went to shit again. The opening in the second floor was still producing bozos who came crashing from above, and now a shattering from the other side indicated a break in the third floor. It was one thing to have to watch all sides, but another to keep checking up to make sure you weren't standing under an outpouring of dead. Dean looked at Charlie as his brain scrambled for ideas on what to do. There were countless bozos on the upper floors, and they'd only planned to tackle a small portion of the first floor today. In his moment of distraction, a bozo came up on his left flank. Dean only had the warning of Charlie's eyes widening slightly. He turned just in time to see someone from the other camp with short and curly blonde hair pounce on the thing and take it down. Dean took out the one coming behind her and then turned to help her up. "Thanks, it's..." He froze as her face came into view. His chest constricted tightly as her familiar eyes widened in shock. "Dean?" she asked, gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles were going white. "Mom?" Dean's voice cracked as he looked at her. He couldn't believe it. He froze to the spot. Something deep and heavy cracked off and broke free inside him, just seeing her face. She moved first, back into action to deflect another bozo, then she whipped back to him and pulled him into her arms. "I thought... well, they said... you..." She shook her head and pulled back, eyes slightly watery. "I'm so happy you're alive," Mary told him, and Dean smiled. "Let's try to stay that way, yeah?" he told her, and she smiled back, jumping easily into the action again. "Donna!" his mom called out after taking down another bozo and swinging back into another one. "Yeah, Mary?" answered the blonde ponytail woman with the thick accent. "That's Dean," Mary told her, smiling even as she took down another one. Just then the roar of the dead got even louder as a wandering mob of them encroached on the exterior doors just as Garth cleared them with the last cement barrier, so Dean never heard her response, just heard the short brown-haired woman yelling, "Donna! We gotta get everyone else over here, we're gonna lose this whole sector!" She had the anger of a concerned mother as she swung her machete around. "Righto, Jodio," Donna answered and picked up the walkie off her utility belt. "Hey fellas, we're gonna need some big guns over here, stat. This is getting out of hand," Donna said as she stepped back to dodge a bozo that Mary easily dispatched so Donna could continue the conversation. The walkie came back a bit garbled through the sounds of bozos, but Dean heard Donna's response clear on this end. "Thanks, Sam. 10-4. Dean's head snapped to his mom, the hope trying to crush him for a moment till he internally beat it back and focused on the task at hand. Face up, stance ready, kill these fucking bozos. He could feel the strain on his arms, all the repeated motions of stabbing, slicing, yanking, kicking, all starting to take a toll on his muscles. The adrenaline was starting to ebb the longer this went on, his limbs going shaky. He wasn't surprised when his next swing went wide and cut into the bozo's shoulder. Just disappointed. Especially when the thing's shoulder gushed, the skin and muscles slid in a gross, wet sound as the thing freed itself and toppled Dean to the ground. He cried out as his leg hit bad, and he knew at the least he'd just sprained it. He got his hands pressed into the thing's chest as its teeth and a lipless mouth snapped in his face. Disgusting smells and textures were all around him. The bozer's entire weight was pressing him down and not allowing him to get leverage. He had no idea where his blade was, but he could hear Charlie calling out to him. He turned his face to the side, still holding back the disgusting thing as he tried to spot his weapon. Dean was tired, though. So tired. His hearing was starting to ring, and maybe he went down harder than he thought if his head was starting to feel fuzzy. He was still struggling away from the thing, the smell of its rotting flesh choking his throat, when it was forcibly kicked off of him. Just in time, too. His vision was starting to swim, everything a little blurry on the edges. "Dean?" said a voice that came from the fuzzy shape above him that had shaggy brown hair. A voice that echoed at him in his dreams and nightmares. "Sammy?" Dean slurred, trying to get up, but his vision blacked out and he found himself back on the ground. The guy moved away to stab a bozo through the head, then he was back, closer to Dean's face so he could actually see him. Dean took in a sharp breath that somehow made his head hurt more. "Oh, thank fuck. It is you," Dean said, and his voice sounded a bit high-pitched and giddy to his ears. There was concern and shock on his baby brother's face. "Dean, Sam started to say as he knelt next to Dean, but then he was ripped away again. Dean heard Sam's frustrated yell as he smashed into more of the rancid things around them. Pain was thrumming through Dean's entire body. He reached a hand up to his head, and when he pulled away, he found his fingers damp and red. Definitely a head injury, then, he thought to himself, and then carefully tried to sit up, but his entire world spun. He tried desperately to keep his stomach calm and finally got his hand around his blade. Just in time, too, because Dean heard the telltale snapping and growling coming toward him again. His vision was partially cleared, but everything still felt sluggish as Dean turned toward the sound. The bozo was pulling itself along the ground while its mangled body was dragging behind it. This one must have been one of the ones to fall from above. The sounds around him blurred as he moved to end the thing. He thought he heard people calling his name. Just as he managed to stab the thing between the eyes, pain exploded from his ankle. This horrible ripping and tearing sensation that made a cold dread sweep through his body. Dean turned to look and saw a bozo clamped onto him. It made him scream in pain, but he somehow fought his instincts and didn't rip his leg away, which should have caused more damage. Which is a horribly funny thought, considering the damage was already done. His blood was raining out of his leg and decorated the bozo's ashen face as it went to town on the Dean special. His vision was suddenly horribly clear in the chaos, but his hearing had shifted to completely echoey, like he was running down a tunnel away from everyone, which is so unfortunate considering that these will be his last moments before someone puts a bullet in his skull. He thought he could hear Sam yelling. And then he sees his favorite giant slicing through the thing, munching on him, so that's done. Then Sam is kind of staring down at him, horrified. Dean wanted to tell him so many things. Ask him so many things. Plus his mom was nearby too, and at least if he has to go out, he gets to do it with them here. He knows they're okay, and that's more than he'd had in a year. There's only one other person he wanted to see right now. "Dean!" The deep gravel of Castiel's voice cut through Dean with both relief and pain. Suddenly his entire vision was Cass. Cass's hands on his cheeks, his blue eyes the only thing Dean wanted to see anymore. "Aye," Dean croaked out, lifting a hand to touch his cheek. He could feel the liquid in his eyes. That was more than enough proof he'd started crying. The man he loved, here with him right now. The only thing he could have wanted. Made sense. He only gets what he wants in life as he's dying. "No, you are not dying. Shut up," Cass told him, which apparently meant he'd said his thoughts out loud. Cass looked to the side away from Dean, and Dean tried to hold him in place. Looking at Cass helped him block out the pain. The relief of them being alive is enough to stave off the strong throbbing, but he was starting to drown in the sensation of utter numbness as his life drained out and the poison bite of the bozo seeped into his leg. "Sam," Cass addressed his brother, a steel voice and hard-edged determination that Dean had heard thousands of times in his life. "Hold him down." Cass ripped off a huge chunk of his shirt, twisted it, and shoved it in Dean's mouth. Fleetingly, Cass stroked his cheek and met his eyes one more time. "You are not allowed to die." Cass grounded out through his teeth, and Dean just nodded weakly, because he'd do anything for Cass. Sam was on top of him then, pressing into his shoulders, and it hurt, so he grunted in pain. His brother gave him a look of apology. Dean's gaze just barely saw Cass standing over his leg and raising the machete in the air. The moment Dean realized what was happening was just as Cass swung the blade down. He felt every bit of it, especially when Cass had to pull back and hack through his leg a second time. He knew he was screaming and blissfully embraced the black when it came. The blackness wasn't complete. Sometimes voices floated to him across the dark. Things about blood loss, his mother worrying, Charlie just talking to him. There were sensations, too, mainly of someone holding his hand, sometimes gentle fingers on his face, and these pin and needle sensations coming from his left foot. But his eyes didn't open, so he squeezed the hand back and wiggled his toes when he could. He didn't know how long the darkness lasted, just that without preamble it suddenly seemed to end. First thing he saw was green leaves on tree branches, which was a very strange thing because it's March in Minnesota, which means it's still winter in the north. Nothing is quite growing yet. Next he noticed how pleasantly warm he was. He was bathed in sunlight, and as his eyes focused, he could see the glass ceiling above him where the sky was shining brightly through. Out of the corner of his eyes he saw bright swaths of color. He turned his head slightly and saw hot air balloons? What the fuck? They were smaller than Dean thought they should be. Turning his head just a bit more caused a faint ache to echo through his skull and something else to tickle his cheek. Dean pulled back slightly and saw a head of dark hair resting next to him, arms folded underneath it like a pillow. Something tight and warm seized his chest, 'cause it was Cass sitting next to his bedside, asleep. Barely anything in the world could have made Dean resist his urge to touch Cass in that moment, so he let his fingers run through the soft, messy hair and felt something akin to a little flame of joy flickering up his throat. Something that sparked along his skin pleasantly as Cass gently pushed his head into the motion. Dean felt his eyes start to water and burn. He'd never really let himself hope enough to think he'd get here. Maybe on the days he wanted to pretend, all he'd thought about was his brother and best friend still being alive. Now that this was his reality, it was everything. Especially when Cass turned his face and Dean got to watch his eyes slowly peel away from sleep, his irises precisely the color of his favorite shade of blue. He could feel himself crying now, and he didn't even care because he knew he was also smiling. Cass saw him, and it seemed to dawn on him very suddenly because he shot up, his eyes going wide at the sight of Dean awake. "Dean," Cass said with both relief and concern at seeing his tears. "Does it hurt? I didn't have another option. Cass cut himself off at the sight of Dean smiling at him. "What is it?" Cass asked, easily grabbing Dean's hand. Even that show of affection brought fresh tears to his eyes. "Saying I missed you doesn't cover it. But..." Dean squeezed Cass's hand, unable to get any more words out. Dean glanced down at their hands and saw his ring on Cass's right ring finger. Then he looked up into Cass's eyes, awed, and just so in love with the man in front of him, it was a wonder Cass didn't know. Dean hoped the look in his eyes as he looked at Cass right now made it clear that all this time, since they were kids, he could never picture anyone else by his side. "Dean, we had to..." Cass seemed distracted by something. He glanced down at the end of the bed. "I cut off your foot. We weren't sure it would work, but it did, and I don't regret it," Cass told him, and Dean wanted to laugh at himself for not noticing. He pulled at the sheets around his leg and saw what he certainly didn't feel before, which is so weird that it couldn't be anything but funny. So when he started laughing, Cass started babbling, clearly concerned. "Kate said it might be a shock when you woke up, but we made sure we had you on as much medication as was safe. They still might have to take the amputation up to the knee, but Kate thought it might be possible as long as your bone doesn't break through the skin or muscle. And we find you a workable prosthetic, ASAP." Cass finished, noticing Dean biting his lip and looking at him like he's the most adorable thing in the world. Cass sighed, a bit annoyed despite it all. "Dean, this isn't funny. I cut off your leg." "You saved my life. Not to mention I have you back, plus Mom and Sam, and I get to become a real-life pirate." Dean was still smiling goofily at Cass's bewildered expression. "This is only a minor loss. I just thought it was funny because I can't feel that it isn't there. In movies you hear about phantom sensations of lost limbs, but I didn't think it would feel this tingly." Dean practically giggled and saw Cass crack the smallest of smiles at his best friend's goofiness. "I guess we were so worried about the pain none of us thought what it would feel like without pain." Cass said with his brow furrowed in thought. Then he looked back at Dean and reached his hand up to Dean's cheek, caressing gently. Dean moved into the motion like an eager cat, closing his eyes as the smallest feelings of bliss lit up inside him. "How are you feeling otherwise?" "Over the moon. Maybe further," Dean answered, opening his eyes to find Cass smiling fondly at him. "As far as Saturn?" Cass asked, stroking his thumb under Dean's eye before pulling back. "Oh, at least," Dean told him. Then they're just staring at each other like total idiots. Dean smiling and Cass smirking back at him, keeping them in a feedback loop of happiness. Dean squeezed their hands again, which drew his gaze back to the silver ring he gave Cass the last night they were together. Dean's thumb fiddled with it lightly so that Cass also looked down, the memory running through both of their minds. "I was so angry that night." Dean shook his head and looked away. "I'd say frustrated," Cass said, dropping their hands, standing up and coming to sit on the edge of Dean's bed so they were even closer. "Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine you yelling that at me." Cass sighed and bumped shoulders with Dean, smiling shyly. "Yeah, not my best moment," Dean admitted, very aware of how Cass's body was pressed up against his in the bed they were now sharing. "Not your worst, either. I'd let jealousy get the worst of me," Cass admitted. Dean let the memory draw him in. Their old group had set up camp in a set of cabins that were once part of a campground in the Mississippi River Valley. Dean had been growing closer with quite a few other camp members, trying to build up their overall strength and developing plans. Cass had been going out on supply runs with Sam, and every night it felt like they were just missing each other. But to Cass, he'd thought Dean was starting a new relationship with someone else, which led to Cass confronting him in Dean's cabin, where Cass told him off for not being around much, and that Dean had never been a person to drop his friends for a relationship in the past. Dean, for his part, had been appalled, defiant even, unable to respond with anything but sarcastic remarks until the truth seemed to explode out of him. "I'm just letting you know that, especially since everything happened, I need you. Even if you might not need me around, Cass said, tears almost forming in his eyes, which ripped through Dean's heart. "You think I don't need you in my life anymore? Cass, that's ridiculous. Dean interrupted Cass, but Cass rebutted smoothly. "I think it's natural to eventually grow out of childhood relationships in search of more long-term—" "You're the only long-term relationship I've ever wanted, you idiot!" Dean yelled at him, which had stunned Cass silent. Dean, realizing just what he'd admitted, started panicking and shook his head. "Everything I've done has either been for you or Sam, but you're not my brother. You're my best friend, which is everything, okay?" But his tone was still seeped in frustrated anger. "I didn't mean to do this like this. Damn it!" Dean rubbed the back of his neck. Cass was still silent, which had Dean fearing the worst. Clearly, Cass was appalled to learn the truth of his best friend. "I don't know what you're thinking if you don't understand how much you mean to me." Dean pulled off the silver band from his finger and set it down with a thunk right in front of Cass, making his point clear. When Cass was still silent, Dean snagged his jacket. "I need some space." The flash flood had happened that night, with Dean off who knows where and separated from their group. What Dean didn't know was how Cass had reacted that night after he left, in those sparse hours before the flood had separated them for the next year. "I'm glad you kept it," Dean said quietly, because Cass was so close he knew he could hear. Cass didn't respond at first. Instead, he pulled himself more up onto the bed next to Dean, turning himself to face Dean better and grabbing his hand again. "I waited for you that night. I was so shocked by what you'd said, and you'd left this." Cass trailed off, holding up his hand to look at it, twisting it on his ring finger using his pinky and middle finger. "I put it on a bit after you left. Then I cried because I felt like such a dumbass for not realizing what idiots we both were. I think I curled up on your bed and fell asleep. Woke up to Sam shouting and a foot of water in the cabin. The rest was a blur. Mainly, I regretted letting you walk away. This entire past year, I would sit and think about how you would still be here if I hadn't frozen." Dean let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "It is my biggest regret." letting you walk out of that cabin without knowing how I felt. Cass sounded so beaten up about that, like the last year had actually been 5 long ones. And Dean could certainly relate. It's been a year. I'd understand if you had moved on, or... Dean pulled Cass into his arms for a hug, crushing him into himself and feeling Cass melt so easily. 25 years I've loved you. Thinking that 1 year could erase that is crazy, Cass. Dean said into Castiel's ear and felt Cass squeeze into him even more tightly as he burrowed his face into Dean's neck. When he pulled back, Dean put a hand to his face, feeling the stubble and smooth skin under his fingertips, the way his own heart soared when Cass leaned into the touch. Especially since I've spent my entire queer awakening being in love with you. You're it for me, sweetheart, Dean told him, shaking a bit at the confession and watching as tears spilled over Cass's eyes, surrounding the blue and water that broke Dean's heart a bit, just remembering exactly how much he loved Cass. Cass leaned into Dean and put their foreheads together, grabbing Dean's hand on his cheek and holding it there as his breaths came in shaky gasps. Then after a moment to regulate his breathing, Cass pulled back and looked Dean in the eyes. I spent a whole year thinking you might be dead and that you'd never know that I love you, Cass told him. Dean looked at him in awe as his green eyes watered over and he started crying too. We're a couple of saps, Dean said through a voice thick with tears, a wonderful mix of happy sadness. I lost my fucking foot and I'm sitting here crying because you're in love with me. Cass chuckled wetly, reaching out to grab Dean's neck just to touch him. You need to get your priorities straight, Cass told him, which made Dean giggle at the horrible British accent Cass used to accompany the quote. God, do I love you, Dean told him, smiling, stroking his thumb over Cass's cheek and dispelling the tear tracks. Cass's eyes were drawn downward to the small, colorful things laying in the sheets. Our bracelets, Cass said, a curious look on his face. Dean glanced down and smirked a bit. In some unknowable way, the 2 friendship bracelets had caught on each other and fallen off without either of them noticing. Did your wish come true? Dean asked Cass, who looked up at him with a smirk on his face, then tilted his head to the side. Did yours? Cass countered, the corners of his eyes crinkling with mirth. Dean rolled his eyes and finally kissed him, because that was answer enough. Turned out that some things in their lives were as easy as that. As easy as sitting in bed together, crying because you're so in love. As easy as leaning in and giving over to that pull between the 2 of you. As easy as free-falling into the safety net of each other's arms. Other things were hard. Surviving in a world full of the dead. Rebuilding society. Forging new bonds and friendships. The growing pains of a new relationship. Losing people, as much as they tried to avoid it. In a world like this, Dean often wondered if there were still beautiful things. The fingers intertwined in his answered that for him, even as they fought back to back, slicing into a herd of bozos. There were beautiful things. So when Dean continued passing on their stories to the people of tomorrow, he would be sure not to leave them out. The prompt was a bit spoilery, so I hid it down here. Thanks so much to ReadLover22. They're amazing. Prompt. So basically, it's set deep into the post-apocalypse world with walkers, just the supernatural characters. Dean and Cass were separated years earlier. Dean thinks Cass is dead and always tells stories about him to anyone he meets. Then they come across a group, have some sort of altercation, and he is shocked to see Cass. Reunion ensues. This was originally posted to AO3 on April 10th, 2021. And that's all, folks.